When I finished uni, I moved back home until I found a job. As soon as I could afford to, I set up a profile on the website Spare Room, which, for those of you that don't know, is a website designed to find house share opportunities and roommate possibilities. I was contacted by James, who had a room to rent on the outskirts of the town that I worked in. It sounded good, but he wanted to talk on the phone before inviting me to view it. We had a single chat one evening, and it turned out we had some things in common. We both enjoyed fitness, particularly swimming, and were movie buffs. By the end of the call, it had felt like chatting to an old friend, and I was looking forward to meeting him in person. James didn't specify his age, but I assumed that he was in his 20s, like me. When I went to view the property, he actually came out of the house next door to greet me. When he introduced himself as James, I was pretty shocked. This guy was at least 50 years old, dressed quite conservatively, and looked like he was wearing a hairpiece. If he'd told me on the phone that he was in his early 20s, I wouldn't have questioned it, because he had a youthful sound to him. But now that I was in front of him, the lack of mentioning age actually gave me pause. I went ahead with the viewing, but I'd already decided that I didn't want to rent a room from him. I wanted to live with people who were a similar age to me. I was also put off by the house decor, which looked like it hadn't been changed since the 80s. When I viewed the bedroom, it looked as if it were occupied by a young person. There were several pairs of trainers and a game console. James said that the previous tenant, Mark, was moving to London for work. Coincidentally, my name is Mark too. James invited me to sit in the living room after the house tour. I didn't want to be rude, so I obliged. He explained that he cared for his elderly mother who lived next door. Then he started complimenting my style, saying that I looked cool. That's when he proceeded to put his hand on my leg, which made me feel very uncomfortable. When he asked if I was interested in the room, I said I had some other properties to view but would be in touch. I then used these make-believe appointments as an excuse to leave. Everything about him screamed red flag, and I just wanted to get out of that house. As soon as I got back to my car, I called my mom to tell her just how freaked out I was, and I absolutely would not be renting the room from James. James texted me a few days later to ask if I'd thought any more about moving in. I lied and said I'd found somewhere closer to town, something more reasonable, something that fit just a little bit better. I did eventually find something with some other young professionals, which turned out to be great. Several months later, as all of this was now in my rear view, our town was shocked by the news that a man's dead body had been found in the fields on the outskirts of town. The deceased was later identified as Mark. I didn't think much of it until I saw that a murder suspect was in custody. It was Mark's landlord, James. You guessed it, the same James whose house I had viewed. Seeing his face on the news gave me instant chills. But that was only multiplied when I realized that the bedroom that I had been scoping out didn't belong to somebody who was moving for work, but it belonged to somebody who in all likelihood had just met their end. Mark had been found almost 6 months to the day after his family reported him missing. The cops stated that they had paid his home and James a visit near the outset of the investigation. But James indicated that he didn't have much interaction with Mark, beyond cashing the rent checks that came on time every month. When the cops looked inside the house, they saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that screamed a crime had been committed there. It just looked as if Mark left one day and never came back. His body, however, told a much different story. Mark was found nearly naked, bound, and while decomposition had been advanced, it was clear that he had suffered a terrible injury to the head, what was likely a death blow, with all things considered. James was ultimately convicted of Mark's murder, although it hasn't been made public why he took Mark's life, or why he opted to do it in such a gruesome manner. It breaks my heart, but also affirms to me that I was right to have the warning bells go off in James's presence. I don't know if I was in danger that day while in James's house, but part of me wonders if Mark ever thought he was in any danger either, before what happened. I don't know if I'll ever learn for certain. And that only adds another creepy feeling to this whole encounter. I work in food service, front of house. So in the early days of the pandemic, with restaurants closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest gig I'd been offered thus far, at least COVID-wise. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could, due to crowds, so I decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want a virus. I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious though, because at that hour, I was already exhausted. After opening up my app and requesting a ride, I stumbled out onto my block, looking for my ride to show up. And to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately. When he pulled up, he asked, "Uber?" To which I affirmed and hopped in the back seat. The ride itself took a while, but I'd only just moved to the area last year, so I wasn't familiar with all the surrounding areas and ultimately thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so I was trying to pass the time by playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one either. So I wanted to save as much of my battery as possible so that I could request another ride back home once my shift was over. I shut my apps down and put my phone into airplane mode, then eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take ride shares, so being alone with a strange driver often put me on edge. But this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about himself. He looked a little like my brother even. Young, clean kept, listening to jazz. Nothing that screamed, "You need to micromanage this trip." When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish his voice from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, ma'am, we're here now." I was embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I just gave a hurried "thanks" and booked it out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked it up on Google, and it appeared to be at a strip mall plaza, which didn't appear to be where I was. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The building itself was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off because it's nighttime, but not the whole building. I skirted across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area, told myself that they must just be renovating, as I followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, but was likely only a few moments, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple locked doors, and some smashed out windows. At this point, I was certain I wasn't going to find a medical office, and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for more bars. I eventually confirmed in my texts that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require any service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try to get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair that he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling in a second trip, considering that this was all just an innocent mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, and before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor by now, and the only stairwell that I was aware of was the one that I had taken up, and it had forced me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past one of those, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something, so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help me get from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride. But the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell, or even a window with balconies, or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort, just in case whoever was downstairs ventured upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured, based on my walk about the floor, that it was basically a giant loop. So I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going, and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without having to encounter them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath as the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was my Uber driver. I figured that he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So that's when I came out from the beam that I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize that this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in the moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think that he'd seen where I'd gone at first. And though I was in a bit of pain, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be a door. It was too dark to tell. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone's flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew that it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open, with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, "There's another one of these guys," as I stumbled backwards, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could find a spot, a voice called out, "All right, this is the police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe it at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued to look for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey, I said on the ground right now. Hands out where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did what he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see that he was truly a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what had just happened, in addition to my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking easy questions, like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk in here or outside?" My total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start catching my bearings just a little bit. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. The first thing that I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" And he explained no, nobody had called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned, and nobody's supposed to be inside. He then stated, "When they are, they're up to no good." He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, that he had resources he could direct me to, and that this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, while also asking if I had somewhere safe to stay the night. But I was stuck on something else that he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around, and the car that had got him into the parking lot in the first place wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed that the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details that I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much at all. But the officer realized that I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so we sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life. And I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived," and "I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" and "I'm flashing my hazards." Finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing that I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off, thus exonerating himself. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and the person that I saw on my app was definitely not the same driver with whom I had just gotten into the car with. The person who had driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this random guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the guy, but the best I could give them to go off of was basically young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and a 4-door sedan, maybe wearing a zip-up sweatshirt, perhaps with a hood, which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in the city. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice it to say, I don't take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver name. You just never know. This happened a couple of decades ago, but I've never forgotten it. It happened when I was 8 or 9 years old, in the late 70s or early 80s, when most malls had an arcade inside. A common thread with all the arcades? They were all pretty dark for some reason. My mother had gotten a job working at the mall, and since it was summer, she insisted that I go with her to the mall where I might find something to do instead of hanging around the house, watching TV, and eating Little Debbie's all day. Her skincare store was boring to me, so I wandered down the corridor to the arcade and watched grown-ups playing skee-ball or whatever games were popular back then. I had no money of my own, but I soon realized that the adults in the arcade were all too happy to give their tickets away to a little girl because they didn't really want to exchange them for Chinese finger traps or a spider ring anyway. Within 45 minutes, I had collected tons of little tickets and was well on my way to buying the Magic 8-Ball, which I was particularly hyped about. I'm walking around looking to see which games have no players but tickets sticking out of them, or looking to see where the adults are who might be willing to give a kid theirs. But it was getting later in the day, and the customers were getting to be fewer and fewer. I'm trying to decide if I should just get the yo-yo with the tickets I have and be done with it, when I see a man standing at the back corner of the building. He smiles a big, friendly smile before waving at me. He's dressed in a solid white 3-piece suit, which I thought was weird, even for that era. He gestures with his hands that I should come over to where he was standing. I was a little confused since I didn't know him. I looked around the place to see if maybe he was waving at someone else. It was very dark in there. Perhaps he thought that I was someone he knew. Or maybe he was the owner of the arcade. Was I in trouble for taking all the unclaimed tickets? He was still smiling and looked nice enough. So I thought I'd be a good kid who listened and followed directions when grown-ups asked them to do something. So I headed his direction. I figured he must have seen me hanging around the arcade and possibly had some tickets, maybe ones that I could have. Yes, the magic 8-ball was still a possibility. As I get closer and closer, I see that there's a neon exit sign above his head, and he's standing directly in front of the rear exit door of the arcade. This isn't a door leading into the open mall, but the back door that would have been used to get out to the parking lot. As I got within a few feet from where he was standing, with his hand now outstretched, I went from feeling calm and happy to totally and utterly terrified. I have no idea why I would have been overcome with such a strong and sudden emotion. The man's facial expression hadn't changed one bit, and he was still smiling. He looked like a sweet, overdressed grandpa. I turned on my Buster Brown sandals and dropped each and every one of those hard-earned tickets and ran as fast as I could through the arcade, out the front door, back into the mall, directly to my mom's store, where she was still giving ladies makeovers. For the longest time, I felt embarrassed whenever I remembered how I ran away from that nice man, and didn't understand why I suddenly got so afraid when there was no clear reason to be afraid. But later, it dawned on me that this man was on the hunt for a little girl who appeared to be alone, one that he could easily walk away with. Standing by the back door, he could have grabbed me and been outside without anyone seeing us. Given all the beeps, whistles, bells, and noises in the arcade, no one would have even heard me scream. My guess is that there was a car waiting just outside that door, and I was only a couple of feet away from having been grabbed and stuffed into the car. There would have been no witnesses left at that time. I don't know what or who put that sudden fear into me, but I'm so grateful for it. I'm still alive and have little girls of my own now, and I never let them go to the arcade. If I didn't get a magic 8-ball, they don't need one either.